Okay, welcome to this discussion of our different models of organizational effectiveness. For this week, what we're going to talk about is the entire course has, again, been really organized around this discussion of effectiveness. And each week, we talk about different strategies and skill sets that will help our organizations become more effective. Now, as we've discussed many times in this course, we also know that effectiveness is a difficult concept to measure and achieve, especially in the public sector. Often in the public sector, our outcomes, our outputs, our goals, our products, our services are not quite as empirical and certainly not as quantitative as they tend to be in the private sector. So we've always struggled in the public sector to measure effectiveness. But as we have measured effectiveness over the years, we always tend to define effectiveness as we did earlier on in this class, and I guess our very first session together. We've defined effectiveness through a goal perspective in terms of how well have we achieved our goals, or how much or what type of progress have we made in the achievement of our goals. So goals really serve as a basis for our measure of effectiveness, typically in the public sector. In our last session, we talked about goals. We talked about the development of goals and how goals contribute to effectiveness. So it's a natural segue into our discussion this week in terms of different ways of measuring effectiveness. And the first way we measure effectiveness is clearly through the use of goals. So the first approach, the goal attainment approach to measuring effectiveness, is by far the most common. It's a linear type of model in that we're looking at the relationship between what we are doing as an organization and the achievement of our goals as a measure of effectiveness. It is the one, again, that we use most of the time in the public sector, but there are some challenges and some obstacles associated with that type of goal attainment approach. But we'll talk about the goal attainment approach. Then we'll talk about some alternative approaches to measuring effectiveness. The second model that we'll talk about is what's called the systems resource model. The third model is the participant satisfaction model. And the fourth model is the internal process model. As we talk about all four of these models, we'll talk about what they emphasize, we'll talk about how they measure effectiveness, but then we'll also talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of each model, in that some models work better in certain situations as compared to other situations. But to start our discussion of these four models of organizational effectiveness, let's start with the first one that we're most familiar with, the goal attainment model. As we know in the goal attainment model, it is, as we said, the simplest approach. And it's based upon this linkage between our stated goals and how well we achieve those stated goals as a measure of effectiveness. Since it is a very simple approach, we do know that simple approaches and simple models do come with a lot of limitations. One major limitation associated with the goal attainment model is that it doesn't really consider a lot of complications. It just looks primarily at the output side, what we are creating as an organization, and measuring the quality of that output in terms of achieving our goals. It assumes that the relationship between what we are doing in our organizations and the achievement of effectiveness is very much of a linear, rational type of relationship. It also assumes that we can identify our goals, we can come up with empirical measures to measure our goals, and that we don't have goal conflict, that we have a single expression, everyone agrees about what the goal is and how to measure that goal. As we talked about in our last session, there are differences between different types of goals. There are official goals and there are operative goals. We identified those official goals as those long-term goals for the organization. We identified those operative goals as kind of those moderate, intermediate range goals that will help us build toward, hopefully, the eventual achievement of that long-term official goal. So one of the problems with the goal attainment approach is sometimes we have trouble coming to agreement on what's considered to be an operative goal and what's considered to be an official goal. So if you do achieve an operative goal, is that a measure of effectiveness? Is that partial effectiveness? Or can we use the achievement of that operative goal as our singular measure of effectiveness for the organization? What if everyone doesn't agree that that's an operative goal? And for some people, that's an official goal. We've achieved the operative goal, but some folks think it's an actual official goal. They're going to overestimate the effectiveness of the organization. The goal attainment approach also fails to take into account a lot of goal conflict that we know, as we've talked about many times so far in this course. Goals, we have a multiplicity of goals, and those different goals oftentimes conflict with each other. It doesn't take into account some of the limitations on goal attainment that can come from the limitations imposed by a tall hierarchical system of organization. As I said before, we also don't oftentimes differentiate between different types of goals and different types of sub-goals. So sometimes the goal attainment approach is a simplistic way, but despite the fact that it is a very simplistic way of measuring effectiveness, it is by far the most common approach that we use in the public sector to measure the effectiveness of an organization. So that's the most common one, the goal attainment type of an approach. But we know that we have some alternative approaches as well. So if our goals are not clear and it's difficult for us to gain agreement on what are our official goals and what are our operative goals, then we need another approach. So a second approach to measuring effectiveness in the public sector is what's known as the systems resource approach. And this is obviously very closely tied to open systems theory in our discussion of organization theorists. This approach concentrates on whether an organization is able to obtain valued resources from the environment. If you harken back to the discussion of open systems theory, open systems theorists argue that organizations don't just dissipate energy and go out of existence over time, that there's this thing that we identified known as negative entropy, whereby instead of going through the entropy process and dissipating energy and then going out of existence, organizations have the capacity to bring new energy into the organization from the external environment. That type of negative energy, negative entropy, is one way in which those organizations can then achieve their homeostasis, that steady state, that balance between the organization and its external environment. So effectiveness under the systems resource approach is going to be measured by the ability of the organization to exploit resources from its external environment. And we've talked about this before when we talked about systems theory. We know a lot of resources from the external environment can be things such as money, political support, adequate, competent labor pool, lots of different energies, lots of different resources that can be brought into the organization. The problem, though, is that measuring the amount of resources and the quality of resources that an organization is able to acquire can sometimes be difficult to do. And it's difficult to measure a lot of these resources because they're oftentimes dependent upon the situation and dependent upon the context of the situation you are dealing with. So say, for instance, one of the resources you're bringing into the organization will be new employees in terms of a new labor pool. Well, how competent and how prepared is that new labor pool? Initially you might think, these are great folks we're bringing into the organization. We don't have to put a whole lot of training and development in these individuals until they get into the organization. And then once they're in the organization doing the job on a daily basis, that's where you start to see some of the flaws in the training and some of the flaws in their preparation that they bring with them into the organization. So it can be kind of subjective in terms of measuring the quality of these types of resources that are being brought into the organization. But you're really measuring effectiveness as your ability to exploit the external environment to acquire these resources to help enhance agency survival. The most appropriate way to measure systems resource model is in a longitudinal nature. So here we would need a longitudinal type of research design where we will observe the amount of resources in all these different categories, personnel and financial and political support, whatever it may be. We measure all those resources at the beginning of our process, and then we measure how those resource levels have changed through that longitudinal type of analysis. Obviously, if we have better resources and more resources a year or 2 or 3 years from now, those could all be measures of effectiveness for the organization. The primary utility of a systems resource approach is when other indicators of effectiveness are difficult to obtain or are hard to measure. So if we have very vague and ambiguous goals, or we have a lot of conflict and multiplicity of goals, it would be difficult for us to use solely the goal attainment model. So you might want to supplement it with this systems resource type of an approach. How well have we exploited our environment to bring necessary resources into the organization? Then a third model of effectiveness the scholars oftentimes use is what's called the participant satisfaction model. And if your organization, or if you work in a city, your city does a lot of citizen satisfaction surveys, those are examples of measuring effectiveness in this participant satisfaction model. It's an ecological model that looks at effectiveness as the ability of the organization to satisfy its key strategic constituencies in its environment. So how happy are people? How satisfied are people with the organization and what the organization is producing? That's your measure of effectiveness. Again, cities do it all the time with citizen satisfaction surveys to see what citizens think about the level and the composition and quality of the services being provided by the city. This is something that organizations do a lot in terms of asking, once people have some interaction with the organization, sending them a survey to ask them how satisfied they are with their interaction with the organization and the organization employee that they interacted with. So that's doing it kind of in this external type of environment, saying we're looking at the participant satisfaction model in terms of how satisfied are the external constituents in our environment. So, politicians, citizens that we're dealing with, perhaps even other organizations that we partner with in the provision and production of certain types of goods and services and programs, but we're looking outside of the organization. So there can be a very much of an external type of focus. When the focus is external to the organization, the participant satisfaction model then starts to bleed into systems resource. So there's a big overlap between these four models, and they're not just discrete models that are mutually exclusive, and that they can certainly overlap with each other. So if we're dealing with external constituencies, we're really bleeding over into the systems resource type of an approach. By contrast, if we are looking within the organization at our internal constituencies, we're looking at our employees. And so we'll do our employee satisfaction types of surveys. And we'll look at employee engagement levels, employee satisfaction levels. And when we're dealing with our internal constituents, our employees, then it becomes more akin to a human resources, human relations type of an approach, because we're looking within our organization. So looking at external constituents, we're kind of bleeding over into the systems resource. When we're looking within our organization at the satisfaction of our employees and developing our employees as resources, then we're kind of more in a human resource, human relations type of an approach to measuring effectiveness. So if our employees are satisfied, if our employees are engaged in what they are doing, if those engagement and satisfaction levels are increasing over a longitudinal period of time, then those are all measures of effectiveness for the organization. So again, look at these models as not being mutually exclusive, that they can really cross over boundaries and can really kind of bleed over from one category to another. But participant satisfaction, how satisfied are our key strategic constituents with what we are doing in the organization? And then your fourth and final approach is the internal process approach. The internal process approach looks within the organization at indicators of efficiency and effectiveness. So we're looking primarily at things like organizational harmony and the internal health of the organization. So if part of that internal health will be a focus on our employees, then it's kind of bleeding over into the human resources, human relations type of an approach. If, however, we're looking at our procedures and our rules and regulations and processes, then obviously it's going to be more of an internal process type of a focus. So some of the indicators of the internal process model of effectiveness are things such as a strong organization culture and a positive work climate, kind of this feeling of esprit de corps, this team spirit that everyone in the organization is in this together and everyone is supporting everyone else within the organization. Teamwork, how much teamwork is going on and what employees feel about their ability to work in teams. The amount of confidence and trust and communication between employees and management. Decision making that is located near information sources, meaning that decisions are being made at the point where the information exists. So those units and those employees who are kind of those street level bureaucrats who are actually implementing these programs and implementing these policies on a daily basis, they have the ability to make important decisions about how that implementation will progress. You don't have decisions being made very much remotely from where the actual work is being done. The decisions occur where the work is being done, regardless of where the sources are in the organizational chart. So again, this kind of argues for that Mary Parker Follett, that kind of bottom up type of participative approach to organizations, kind of that democratic type of an organization. The sharing of relevant facts and feelings, both horizontally and vertically. So again, you've got this horizontal and vertical communication system that everyone knows how to access and everyone has enough faith in it, enough trust in it, so that they're willing to share feelings and willing to share facts, not only with their coworkers horizontally, but also vertically through the organizational chart. Things such as the reward system. What types of reward systems do we have? And are those reward systems predicated upon performance? Are we able to measure performance and then reward people for performance? Are we able to help develop subordinates, help develop employees, create effective working groups? Interaction between the organization and all of its parts. This is your measure of organizational health and organizational harmony. Is everything working together well within the organization so that any conflicts that do occur between different parts of the organization, all of those conflicts are being resolved in the best interest of the organization itself? So again, we're talking organizational health, organizational harmony with this internal process approach. Where we're looking inside the organization, if we're looking at rules, regulations, processes, procedures, we're very much looking at the internal process approach. Once we start talking about employees and developing employees and making employees satisfied and engaged, then it starts bleeding more over to what we talked about with human relations and human resource management. So again, we've got 4 different models, but they're not all that different in that they can cross over with each other. The goal attainment model, the systems resource model, the participant satisfaction model, and the internal process model. The big so what question is obviously, well, so what? Well, it's important because if we are going to work toward making our organizations and the public sector writ large as effective as possible, we need to have some good, clear indication of what we consider to be effective. If different people have different definitions of effectiveness, then obviously we're never going to be able to come up with strategies to achieve effectiveness because no one can agree on what we mean by effectiveness. So these 4 models are just 4 different ways in which you can define and measure effectiveness in public organizations. So let's get a little bit more, and again, as I said, the internal process model can bleed over with human resource approach, and it really depends upon where your focus is within the organization. So let's get a little bit more specific then. When we look at these 4 different models of effectiveness, what are some of the specific dimensions and measures that we can look at within organizations to determine effectiveness? Obviously, we're interested in overall effectiveness of the organization, but we look at productivity and we measure changes in trend lines, in patterns, in the productivity of the organization. We know that effectiveness and efficiency are sister values that kind of go hand in hand with each other. They're not the same, but again, every organization focuses both on effectiveness as well as efficiency. So, efficiency, are you creating more output with fewer resources? For most organizations in the public sector, profit is not a major measure or dimension unless you're a government corporation or perhaps a government sponsored enterprise. The quality of the outputs that we are producing. Do we have quality control mechanisms in place to ensure that there's equivalent quality across the products that are being created by the organization? Accidents, a lot of organizations do this. They will measure the number of days between accidents. Sometimes organizations will use that as a discrete effectiveness measure. The growth of the organization, certainly in a systems resource model, if you are growing your appropriations, then you are obviously looking at that as a measure of your effectiveness. Absenteeism as kind of a surrogate for employee dissatisfaction. Higher levels of dissatisfaction will lead to higher levels of absenteeism. Same type of thing with employee turnover. I know many of you are looking at employee turnover as one of the problems that you're trying to solve or at least mitigate in your organizations, because employee turnover is a major problem in a lot of our public organizations. Costs our organizations a lot of money. The more employee turnover that you have, the less able you'll be to achieve your goals in a goal attainment type of a model. Also, the more employee turnover you have, the more demand in a systems resource model for you to bring new blood and new people into your organization. The more turnover you have, obviously, the more brain drain you have, and then the more emphasis must be placed upon training and development, and it will fundamentally change the internal processes within your organization as well. Similar with job satisfaction, again, lower levels of satisfaction are going to lead to absenteeism and turnover. So, these are not what you would normally think of with independent variables and like a multiple regression analysis in the terms of you're going to have a lot of multi-collinearity. You're going to have a lot of relationships between these different variables. Motivation, and we'll spend our future class session devoting the entire session to motivational theories. And so we'll get into motivation a lot more in a future week, but how motivated employees are can be a measure of effectiveness as well. Employee morale, the control mechanisms that are in place in the organization, that would be part of an internal process type of a model. Amount of conflict and or cohesion within the organization, another indicator in an internal process type of model. Flexibility, adaptation. So that could be a measure of the internal process model, but it's also probably going to relate to a systems resource model as well. Because if you want to exploit resources from your environment and import new resources in, you are going to need to adapt your organization to match the changes in the external environment. Like we talked about last week, strategic planning and goal setting of an essential aspect of the goal attainment model, as we talked about. Goal congruence or goal consensus. Do we have agreement in terms of goal consensus between everyone in the organization? In goal congruence, do we have individual goals that are in alignment with organizational goals? Again, very important for the goal attainment type of model. Role and norm congruence, looking at the internal process type of an approach. Managerial interpersonal skills, very much looking at from a participant satisfaction perspective inside the organization, the human relation skills of managers and supervisors. Managerial task skills, the ability of management to know the tasks of the organization, understand the tasks that employees are doing. Again, kind of participant satisfaction, but also internal process model. Information management and communication, very much in terms of the internal process type of model. The readiness of the organization really relates to systems resource model and the ability of the organization to respond to changes in the external environment. Utilization of the external environment, very much systems resource type of a model. Evaluations by external entities, very much a systems resource as well as participant satisfaction type of an approach. Stability, internal process approach, but also can relate to a systems resource approach as well in terms of finding that point of homeostasis, that steady state between the organization and its environment, as open systems theorists will tell us. The value of human resources, very much that focus on human relations, human resource inside the organization, merging over with participant satisfaction with that focus internal to the organization. Participation, shared influence, internal process bleeding over into a participant satisfaction, human resource, human relations type of an approach. Training and development emphasis, again, same thing as above, looking at the internal process model combined together with the human relations, human resource type of approach in a participant satisfaction type of orientation. And achievement emphasis. Achievement emphasis in terms of achieving organizational goals, but also achievement emphasis in terms of individual goals and aspirations. Harkening back to Abraham Maslow and the hierarchy of needs, and that people have these growth needs, and that as McGregor and Arger has told us, that the organization can help people go through that personal growth process in order to achieve their wants, needs, and desires and their individual goals. So those are just some of those specific types of measurements that we can find in our organization that contribute to those four main models of effectiveness. The indicators that we will use obviously will depend upon which model of effectiveness we are utilizing and how we are measuring the term effectiveness. So to help compare these four models again, let's take a look at this final slide. This is a chart that we get from authors named Quinn and Rohrbach. And what Quinn and Rohrbach do here, they call this their competing values framework. And what they do here is they kind of restructure our four different models of organizational effectiveness a little bit, but show us how we can compare them to each other. So they're going to take our models of organizational effectiveness, kind of using a little bit different names, but it's the same type of idea, and then compare these four competing frameworks, as they call them, these four different frameworks or models for effectiveness, based upon two main characteristics. You'll see there's an x-axis and there is a y-axis. The x-axis is this dimension of internal focus to external focus. So all those frameworks, all those models that have an internal focus looking within the organization are on the left side of the chart. All those that have an external focus are on the right side of the chart. So we can distinguish them based upon their internal versus external focus. Then we can also use the y-axis, where you can distinguish between these different models based upon how much flexibility they afford or how control-oriented they are. Those models at the bottom of the screen are control-oriented. Those at the top of the screen are much more flexibility-oriented. So you start at your bottom right. And your bottom right is, they call it the rational goal model. This is our goal attainment model, the first model that we started out talking about this evening. In this rational goal, this goal attainment type of model, we're going to do a lot of what we talked about last week, a lot of strategic planning, a lot of goal setting, and hopefully that strategic planning, that goal setting will lead to higher levels of productivity and efficiency. And our effectiveness measure then will be, if our productivity increases, we're clearly achieving that goal of the organization. So it's very much, we're trying to achieve the goal of the organization. That's our measure of effectiveness. It's very much of a control-oriented type of model, and it's also on the right side of the screen, which makes it a little bit more external in nature, because our strategic planning, our goal setting, will certainly be strongly influenced by a lot of different elements outside the organization, will be strongly influenced by that external environment. You move up into the top right-hand cell. They call it the open systems model. This is what we refer to as our second model, the systems resource model. Systems resource model clearly is an external focus, placing it on the right side of the chart. And it's also a focus on flexibility, because organizations need to be flexible and adaptable to their external environment if they're going to acquire necessary resources from that external environment. Means you have to be flexible, you have to be ready so that you can acquire those resources and grow. So your ultimate goal is growth through the acquisition of resources. Now, we also said that when you are acquiring those resources like political support, or when you are acquiring resources such as enhanced appropriations, those enhanced appropriations are going to come from political support. That political support is going to come from the satisfaction of members of the external environment with the organization. So if elected officials are happy with what the organization's doing, if constituent groups outside the organization are happy with what the organization is doing, they're going to place pressure on elected officials in order to get more appropriations for the organization. The organization is going to be looked upon fondly by citizens and the public, which will then make it easier to attract quality employees into the organization. So there is some type of a participant satisfaction type of element here with the open systems type of approach as well. So even though we're talking about this as systems resource model, open systems model, whatever term you'd like to use for this second model, it's important to know that kind of subsumed within that is that third model, that participant satisfaction model, when the participants who are being satisfied are external to the organization. So you can kind of take that third model, the participant satisfaction model, and superimpose it onto the systems resource model, as well as superimpose it on that third model up there in the top left. They call it the human relations model. This is kind of the participant satisfaction model internal to the organization. So when we identify our constituencies that we need to please and satisfy as being within the organization, then our focus really becomes on human relations and human resource management. We need to develop more cohesion and more morale among our employees by giving them these opportunities to develop. If we provide them with these opportunities to develop, we give them the ability to self-govern, like in a HRM or human relations type of theoretical approach, then essentially we're making them more satisfied. And the more satisfied they are, that's a measure of the effectiveness of the organization. So if you're doing a good job developing your employees, you're satisfying your employees through these human relations and human resource types of theories and approaches, that's kind of that internal focus of the participant satisfaction model. So that third model, the participant satisfaction model, I would say is partly the systems resource on the top right, and then partly the human relations approach that Quinn and Rohrbach referred to on the top left. So if you're putting our third model, you're going to put it at the top, and you're going to kind of divide it, depending upon whether it's an internal focus on employees or an external focus on external constituencies. Then the fourth model at the bottom left is this last model we talked about, the internal process model. Internal process model looking at how we manage information, how we manage communication systems in order to provide for stable processes within the organization. The better control you have over the processes in the organization, the more stable your internal processes are. Those will all be measures of effectiveness for that organization. So again, the whole purpose of this is kind of like fit it into this Quinn-Rohrbach typology so you can kind of see how they compare with each other, all four of those models. Again, the goal attainment, what they call the rational goal model, is by far the most common that we see used in the public sector. Systems resource model tends to be used whenever we don't have clear goals and we can't use one of the other models. We tend to use the systems resource type of a model. The participant satisfaction model depends upon whether it's an external or an internal focus, or we're satisfying either external or internal constituencies, and how well we do that is then a measurement of the effectiveness of the organization. And then finally, the internal process model, looking within the organization, very much oriented around control, controlling our processes, putting together rational processes. If we have those well-controlled, stable, rational processes and procedures, those will all be measures of organizational effectiveness. So going back to that so what question of, well, so what? The so what question is, well, what does this mean then for your organization and your organization striving for effectiveness? What you're going to be doing, obviously, is you're going to be looking at your organization in your next Canvas essay, and you're going to be asking that question. Which of these models of organizational effectiveness do you see in your organization? Again, they are not mutually exclusive, and you can certainly see more than one model of effectiveness in your organization. But how does your organization measure effectiveness? Is it goal oriented? Is it resource oriented? Is it satisfaction oriented? Is it process oriented? That's an important consideration because as you think about the problem that you've identified to use in this class for all of your assignments, that problem is inhibiting effectiveness. And so if it's inhibiting effectiveness, what type of effectiveness is it inhibiting? Is it inhibiting the organization's ability to achieve its goals? Is it inhibiting the organization's ability to acquire necessary resources from the environment? Is it inhibiting the organization's ability to satisfy its internal and external constituencies? Is it inhibiting the ability of the organization to have rational, stable, well-controlled work processes? So as you can see, it really depends upon your organization and how this problem is affecting the definition of effectiveness that your organization uses. Again, as you work on that Canvas essay, remember that you can have multiple models of effectiveness in one given organization. So I hope this is helpful in terms of allowing us to try and start defining effectiveness within our organizations and recognizing that's a very contextual, contingency-based type of definition. And I hope this is some information that you'll be able to incorporate into your thinking as you go through your 3 alternative solutions and can use this kind of as a basis to help select which alternative you think is most appropriate and most realistic to then advocate for in your final paper, which is your chosen solution assignment. Again, I hope this is useful. This is our recording up on our website, so you can go through and review this at your leisure. When we get together again in our next class session, we'll start out that class session doing some breakout groups, kind of playing around with these 4 different models of effectiveness before we then move into our topic for that evening, which will be motivational theories. So if you have any questions about any of this information, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you again then next week as we talk about motivational theories. So have a great week and take care, everyone.